The night Clara was thrown out, it was snowing. Not a gentle snow. Not the kind that settles softly on windowsills and makes the world look clean and forgiving. The kind that falls sideways and stings your face and finds every gap in your coat and makes you understand, without any softness at all, that the weather has no interest in your circumstances. She stood on the front step with one bag, both hands pressed against her stomach. 9 months pregnant. 71 years old. Just let that settle for a moment. 71 years old. A pregnancy her doctor had called medically extraordinary and personally terrifying in the same quiet sentence. A pregnancy her family had called a mistake from the moment they found out. Not gently, not privately, not with any of the careful consideration that difficult conversations deserve. Loudly. Repeatedly. In the specific cruel shorthand of people who have decided that their embarrassment matters more than your life. And now this. Her son had changed the locks that evening. Not a landlord. Not a stranger with legal paperwork and a formal process. Her son. The boy she had raised entirely alone after his father disappeared when the child was 3 years old and left behind nothing but a utility bill and a silence Clara had spent years learning to stop explaining to people. That boy. The one she had worked double shifts for. The one she had gone without new shoes for 3 winters running so he could have the ones he wanted for school. The one she had sat up with through fevers and failures and the particular 2 a.m. despairs of adolescence, never once making him feel like a burden even when she was running on nothing. That boy had packed one bag for her, placed it on the step, and said 7 words that she would carry in her chest like a stone for a very long time afterward. "You've embarrassed this family enough," he said. She looked at him for a moment. At this man her son had become, composed, certain, wearing his decision like a coat he had tried on many times before finally putting it on in public. She didn't argue. Not because she had nothing to say. She had years of things to say. But standing in a doorway in the snow 9 months pregnant is not the moment for any of them, and Clara had always known, instinctively, which battles could be won and which ones had already been decided before she arrived. She picked up the bag, walked down the step, heard the door close behind her, did not look back. The snow was coming harder now. The street ahead empty and white and indifferent. She had $11 in her coat pocket, a phone with 4% battery, and no clear destination. She walked 3 blocks, 4. Her shoes soaking through immediately, the cold working up through her feet into her ankles. The baby shifted inside her, a slow rolling movement that she had learned over months to read like a language. Not distress. Just presence. Just the quiet confirmation that she was not, whatever else was true tonight, entirely alone. She turned the corner onto Ellery Street without planning to. And stopped. Because the house on the corner, the one the whole town avoided without ever fully explaining why, the one that had been empty since before Clara could remember, the one that children crossed the street to avoid, and adults discussed only in the careful lowered voices reserved for things that make no rational sense, had its front door open. Not broken open. Not damaged. Open. Deliberately. 6 inches of warm yellow light spilling out onto the snow-covered path. Warm light. In a house without electricity. That had been empty for decades. Clara stood in the snow and stared at that light for a long moment. Every sensible instinct she had said keep walking. But her feet had already stopped. And something else, something quieter and older than instinct, something that lived below the level of thought, was pulling her toward that open door with a certainty she had no language for. She pressed her hand against her stomach. The baby moved again. Toward it. Everyone in town knew about the house on Ellery Street. Not through facts. Not through any single documented event or official record or news story anyone could point to specifically. Small towns don't work that way. They know things the way water knows the shape of a riverbed. Slowly, completely, through years of quiet accumulation until the knowledge is simply part of the landscape and nobody remembers when it wasn't there. Children crossed to the other side of the road without being told to. Delivery drivers skipped the block entirely and left packages at the corner. The woman at the hardware store had told Clara years ago, casually, the way you mention something everyone already knows, that 3 separate families had tried to move into that house since 1987 and not one of them had lasted a full week. Clara had never asked why. She was asking herself that now. Standing at the open gate in the snow, one bag over her shoulder, both hands pressed against her stomach, 68 years of practical common sense telling her clearly and firmly to turn around and find a motel and deal with this situation like a rational adult. She was not, it turned out, feeling particularly rational tonight. She pushed the gate open and walked toward the door. Clara Morgan had never been the kind of woman who made decisions dramatically. That was the first thing anyone who knew her well would have told you. She was methodical. Quiet in the way of someone whose mind moves constantly but whose mouth waits until it has something worth saying. She had worked as a bookkeeper for 31 years. The same firm, the same desk, the same careful columns of figures that needed to balance at the bottom, and she had applied that same patient precision to everything else in her life. Her son's upbringing, her finances, her grief when it came. Everything organized, everything considered, everything accounted for. She was 71 years old. Silver hair she kept cut practically short, no vanity in it. A slim frame that had stayed that way through decades of modest eating and long walks taken not for fitness but because walking had always been where she did her best thinking. Deep brown eyes that people had always described as watchful, not suspicious, just present. The kind of eyes that notice things other people slide past. Those eyes noticed the path. Clear stone leading to the open door, no debris, no overgrowth blocking it, just a clean direct line through a yard that should by every reasonable measure have been completely impassable after decades of neglect. As though someone had come through recently and prepared it. As though someone had known she was coming. She stepped through the front door. The warmth hit her immediately. Real warmth, the deep settled warmth of a room that has been heated for hours, not the thin temporary warmth of something recent. It made no sense. The house had no utilities. Had been empty since 1987. There was no rational source for what she was feeling on her face and hands and the cold-soaked front of her coat. She stood in the entrance hall and let it reach her anyway. The door swung closed behind her. Softly. Slowly. Without wind. She turned immediately. Hand on the handle. It turned cleanly. She was not locked in. She confirmed that first, the way a careful woman confirms the exit before she goes anywhere unfamiliar. She stood there with her hand on the handle for a long moment. Old doors close on their own, she told herself. Drafts exist. Warm air from unknown sources has explanations that simply require investigation. She was a bookkeeper. She believed in columns that balanced. She would find the explanation. Then she heard it. From somewhere directly above her. From the upper floor of a house that had been empty for 37 years. A child's voice. Small. Clear. Unhurried. Singing something she almost recognized. A melody that tugged at the very edge of her memory the way certain smells do, pulling at something stored so deep it has no clear address. Clara stood completely still in the warm hallway of an impossible house. And listened. And did not, for reasons she could not have explained to anyone, feel afraid. Clara did not go upstairs that night. Her body made that decision before her mind could argue about it. 71 years old, 9 months pregnant, soaked through from the snow, standing in a warm hallway that had no business being warm. Her legs simply declined to carry her up a staircase in the dark toward a sound she couldn't explain. Some decisions aren't made. They're simply recognized. She found the front room. Large. High-ceilinged. A fireplace on the far wall that stopped her completely in the doorway. It was burning. Not smoldering. Not the last dying heat of something that had burned hours ago. Burning, steadily, generously, with a particular settled quality of a fire that has been properly laid and properly fed and has been going for some time. Orange light moving across the walls. The smell of wood smoke that was somehow both completely foreign and deeply, inexplicably familiar. Clara stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she walked to the fire and sat down in front of it on the dusty floor and held her hands out toward the heat and decided, deliberately, consciously, with the full weight of her 31 years of making practical decisions in impossible situations, that she would deal with the explanations in the morning. She slept badly. Not from fear exactly. From the particular hyper-awareness of a body and mind that know they are somewhere they cannot fully account for. She lay with her coat folded under her head, and her bag pressed against her back, and her hands resting on her stomach, and listened to the house around her. It made sounds, but not the sounds of emptiness. Not the random settling noises of an uninhabited structure working through the cold. Something more deliberate than that. More present. The house sounded, in the way that houses sometimes do after decades of learning the people inside them, like a place that knew someone was home. She woke before dawn with that thought still sitting quietly in her chest, and went upstairs. The hallway above was narrow and dark, 3 doors leading off it, morning gray coming through a small window at the far end. Clara moved slowly, one hand on the wall, following something she couldn't name toward the door at the end of the hall. She knew before she opened it. Not what she would find, but that this was the door. That whatever had been singing last night had come from here. That this was what the house had been waiting to show her. She pushed it open. A child's bedroom. And here was the thing that made her breath stop completely. It was not abandoned. Every other room she had seen in this house carried the unmistakable mark of long emptiness. Dust on every surface, peeling walls, the specific gray neglect of decades. This room had none of that. The floor was clean. The small bed in the corner had a quilt folded neatly at its foot. Handmade, hundreds of small hexagonal pieces in warm colors, the stitching tight and careful and clearly made with time and love rather than speed. A wooden chair beside the bed. A shelf of children's books arranged by height along one wall. A small oval rug on the floor that showed no dust, no fading, no age at all. As though someone had been in here recently. As though someone had been taking care of it. Clara moved to the shelf. Ran one finger along the spines of the books. Copyright dates from the 1950s. Old books, genuinely old, but clean and intact. She pulled one gently from the shelf and opened it. On the inside cover, in a child's handwriting, a name. Not a name she recognized. A name that made no sense here. She put the book back carefully and turned to the wooden chair. Something had caught her eye on the back leg. A mark in the wood, slight and easy to miss, made by something small and sharp pressed deliberately into the grain. She crouched down slowly, one hand on the chair back for balance. 2 letters. Carved so carefully they were almost part of the wood itself. C. M. Clara Morgan. Her initials. In a chair. In a room. In a house she had never entered in 71 years of living 3 blocks away. She straightened up very slowly. Looked around the room that had no dust and no neglect and no explanation. Pressed both hands flat against her stomach. And stood there in the gray morning light of a child's bedroom that had apparently been waiting for her. For how long, she had absolutely no idea. With more questions than she had walked in with, and not a single answer to show for any of them. She sat on the edge of the small bed for a long time. The quilt beneath her hands soft and real. The initials on the chair back visible from where she sat. Small and deliberate and absolutely impossible. The shelf of old books standing in its careful order along the wall. The gray morning light coming through a window that had no dust on the glass despite decades of neglect surrounding it on every side. Clara was not a woman who panicked. She had established that about herself over 71 years of situations that had required steadiness. A husband who left without warning, A son raised on a single income, medical appointments delivered in the careful measured tones that doctors use when the news requires cushioning. She had sat through all of it with her hands folded and her breathing even and her mind working steadily through what needed to be done next. She sat through this the same way. Hands folded, breathing even, mind working, and arriving, repeatedly, at the same wall. There was no rational explanation for this room. She went through it again, methodically, the way she had gone through columns of figures that refused to balance, starting from the beginning, checking each element individually, looking for the error she must have made somewhere. The cleanliness. Possible if someone had been coming in regularly. But who, and why, and how without anyone in this town noticing? The quilt, genuinely old by the feel of the fabric, the slight softness of cloth washed many times over many years, but in perfect condition. The books, 1950s copyright dates, meaning they had been here since before Clara was old enough to read. The rug showing no wear. The window showing no grime. And the chair. She kept coming back to the chair. CM. She had not misread them. Had not imagined the slight roughness of carved lines beneath her fingertip. Had not invented the precise deliberateness of two letters pressed into wood by someone who had wanted them to last. Her full name was Clara Margaret Morgan. She had been Clara Margaret since birth, her mother's choice, a name she had been told almost nothing about because her mother had died when Clara was 4 and the grandparents who raised her had spoken of that loss only in the careful minimum required. Her initials were CM. And someone had put them here. In this chair. In this room. In this house that the whole town had avoided for 37 years without ever fully explaining why. She stood up. Walked to the window. Below, the snow-covered yard, the clear stone path still visible leading from the gate to the front door. Beyond the gate, Ellery Street quiet in the early morning. Her footprints from last night still there in the snow, the only footprints. Coming in. No others. Nobody had been here last night. Nobody had laid that fire or warmed that entrance hall or cleaned this room or arranged those books in the hours before she arrived. Which meant all of it had been here already. Waiting. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and closed her eyes. The baby moved inside her. That slow rolling familiar movement that she had spent months learning to read. Not distress. Something almost deliberate. The specific movement Clara had come to think of, in the private language that develops between a woman and the child she is carrying, as the movement that meant, pay attention. She opened her eyes. Looked at the room again. The shelf. The quilt. The chair. A room prepared for a child. In a house that somehow already knew her name. She thought about her mother. The woman she could not remember. 4 years old was too young for real memory, old enough only for impressions. Warmth. A particular smell she had spent decades half recognizing. Hands that she remembered as gentle without being able to picture them clearly. Her grandparents had told her almost nothing. Had changed the subject when she asked. Had described her mother as someone who had died young and poor and without provision. Clara had believed them. She had believed them for 67 years. Standing in this room, with her initials in the chair and her footprints the only ones in the snow outside, and a fire that had been burning in an empty house and a child's voice singing in the night. For the first time in 67 years, she wondered if she had been wrong too. She found the letters in the fireplace. Not by searching. Not by methodically working through the house the way she had worked through everything else. Room by room, surface by surface, looking for the explanation that kept refusing to appear. She found them by accident, the way the most important things are usually found. She was kneeling in front of the fireplace, adding wood from the small stack beside it, when her hand touched something at the back of the firebox that was not brick. Metal. Cold and solid and completely out of place. She reached further in. Felt the shape of it. A small box, iron by the weight, set deliberately into a recess in the back of the firebox where the heat never fully reached. Someone had built this hiding place into the fireplace itself. Had planned it. Had wanted whatever was inside to survive everything that might happen to the house around it. She lifted it out carefully. Set it on the floor in front of her. It was not locked. The lid opened with a slight resistance, the seal of something that has been closed for a very long time finally giving way, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect against moisture and time, were 11 envelopes. Each one sealed. Each one addressed in the same handwriting, small, careful, slightly forward-leaning, to the same person. To Clara. When you are ready. She sat on the floor with her back against the fireplace and opened the first one. And then the second. And then she stopped counting and simply read. The letters were from her mother. Her mother. The woman her grandparents had described in the careful minimum of people protecting a child from something. Died young, died poor, left nothing behind. The woman Clara had spent 71 years constructing from impressions rather than facts. Warmth. A smell. Hands she remembered as gentle without being able to see them clearly. That woman had written 11 letters. Had written them knowing she was dying. The diagnosis named plainly in the second letter, the timeline described without self-pity, the remaining time measured not in grief but in what could still be accomplished within it. And what her mother had accomplished in that time was extraordinary. She had purchased this house in 1951, the year Clara was born. Had bought it with money saved over years of work that the letters described in careful detail, early mornings, late evenings, every spare dollar directed toward one specific purpose. Had furnished the upstairs room herself. Had sewn the quilt during her pregnancy, each hexagonal piece cut and stitched by hand during the months she was carrying Clara, the work slow and deliberate and done with the full knowledge that the hands making it would not be there to show the finished thing to the child it was made for. Had carved the initials into the chair herself. Had placed the photograph on the shelf. Had arranged the books by height the way Clara would one day discover them, because her mother had imagined this moment. Had sat in that room during the 2 years her diagnosis had given her and looked forward across decades and imagined her daughter standing exactly where Clara was standing now. And had wanted her to feel, when she arrived, that someone had been here first. That someone had prepared the ground. The legal arrangements were described in the 7th letter. A solicitor, named, his practice address given, the instruction that his family continue the arrangement passed through generations clearly documented. The house placed in a trust that could not be touched or sold or transferred by anyone. Not by grandparents. Not by anyone who might, for their own reasons, prefer Clara never found her way here. The trust had one condition. Not a date. Not an age. Not a circumstance that could be predicted or scheduled. Simply, her arrival. When Clara came, the house was hers. Her mother had understood something that the letters named directly in the 9th envelope, in handwriting that had grown slightly less steady as the pages progressed, the physical evidence of a body working against time to finish something that mattered. I cannot know when you will need this, her mother had written. I only know that you will. And I know you, even though you will not remember me, well enough to know that when you arrive here, you will have needed it for some time already. I am sorry I cannot be there. I am sorry for every year between us. But I want you to know that I looked forward and I saw you. I saw you clearly. And everything I had, I left where you could find it. Clara set that letter down on the floor beside her. Pressed both hands flat against her stomach. The fire beside her burned steadily. Warm and unhurried. The fire that had been burning when she arrived. That had been burning, she now understood, because the solicitor's granddaughter had received a call from a neighbor and had come to prepare the house because Clara's arrival had finally, after 71 years, been confirmed. Someone had known she was coming. Had always known. Had left a door open in the snow and a fire burning in the dark and 11 letters in an iron box in the back of a fireplace for exactly this night. Her mother had loved her across an impossible distance. And Clara, sitting on the floor of a house that had been hers since before she could walk, Finally, completely felt it. She called the solicitor the next morning. The number was in the 7th letter, written in her mother's careful forward-leaning handwriting beside a practice address on the main street that Clara had walked past 100 times without ever having reason to go inside. Third generation now, her mother had noted in the letter with the quiet practicality of someone planning across decades. The arrangement will hold. I made certain of it. It had held. The woman who answered, calm, efficient, clearly expecting this call, introduced herself as Catherine. Third generation, as promised. She spoke about the file with the familiarity of someone who has been briefed on it thoroughly and has been waiting, in a professional and patient way, for it to finally become active. Everything is in order, Catherine said. It has been in order for a very long time. Clara sat at the kitchen table of the house on Ellery Street and listened to those words settle into the room around her. Her table. Her kitchen. Her house. The transfer of legal ownership took 1 week. Catherine handled every detail with the thoroughness of someone honoring an obligation that had been passed down through 3 generations of her family like something genuinely precious. Not a burden, not an inconvenience, but a trust in the original meaning of that word. Clara signed the final papers on a Thursday morning with a pen Catherine produced from her coat pocket, and the particular stillness of a woman doing something she cannot fully absorb yet but knows is real. She was 2 weeks from her due date. She used those 2 weeks in the way Clara Morgan had always used difficult time, practically, completely, without wasting any of it on things that couldn't be changed. The house needed work. Not structurally. Her mother had built on solid ground and chosen well, and the bones of the place had held through decades of emptiness with the quiet integrity of something made to last. But the surfaces carried their years plainly. Peeling walls. Seized pipes that needed coaxing back into function with patience and the right tools. Windows that let the cold through at the corners in thin persistent drafts that she sealed methodically, one by one, working her way through each room with weather stripping and a calm focus that kept her body warm and her mind occupied. Dot arrived on the 3rd day. Clara still wasn't entirely sure how Dot had known she was there. The woman offered no explanation, simply appeared at the front door on a gray Wednesday morning carrying cleaning supplies in one hand and a covered dish in the other, looked at Clara with a direct assessing gaze of someone determining what needs doing, and said, "Where do you want me to start?" Clara had pointed at the kitchen. Dot had started there and worked outward and hadn't stopped coming back since. There are people like that in every life, if you are fortunate. People who appear in difficult moments without announcement and ask what needs doing before they ask how you are. Clara had met very few of them in 71 years, and she received this one with the specific gratitude of someone who has learned not to question gifts that arrive in useful forms. Together they worked through the house room by room. Everything except the upstairs room at the end of the hall. That room Clara kept for herself. She went in alone each evening after the day's work was done and stood in the doorway looking at the small bed and the neatly folded quilt and the shelf of old books and the wooden chair with its 2 carved initials. Not working. Not cleaning. Just being present in a space that had been waiting for her longer than she had been alive. Her mother had sat in that chair. Had looked at these same walls and imagined her daughter standing here. Clara sat in the chair one evening, carefully, both hands on the armrests, her pregnancy making every movement deliberate, and felt the specific, overwhelming tenderness of occupying a space that someone loved you enough to prepare. She put her fingers on the carved initials. Felt the slight roughness of letters pressed into wood by hands she couldn't remember. "I'm here," she said quietly. To the room. To the house. To her mother. The fire downstairs burned steadily. The house, for the first time in a very long time, felt entirely inhabited. Her son came on a Wednesday. Clara saw the car first. She was in the kitchen when she heard it. The specific sound of that engine, a sound she had heard pulling into driveways for 20 years, so familiar it registered before she consciously identified it. She moved to the window and looked out without hurrying. without the automatic tightening in the chest that his arrival had produced in her for the past year. That response, she noticed with quiet interest, had simply stopped being available to her sometime in the weeks since the snow and the open door and the 11 letters in the iron box. She watched him park across the street. He sat in the car for 4 minutes before getting out. She counted without meaning to, the bookkeeper's habit of measuring things precisely. For minutes of sitting in a parked car before approaching his 71-year-old pregnant mother's door told her more about his state of mind than anything he would say once he got inside. He was uncertain. She had not seen that in him for a long time. He got out, stood on the pavement and looked at the house with an expression she could read clearly from the kitchen window, the expression of someone whose expectation has been disrupted before he has even knocked. Because the house on Ellery Street was not what he had pictured when he had heard, through whatever channel that information had traveled, that his mother was living here. He had pictured survival. Bare minimum. A woman making do. He was looking at cleaned windows. A repaired front step. Smoke rising steadily from the chimney. Window boxes along the front with early growth visible in them, small and green and entirely unbothered by the opinions of anyone on the pavement outside. Clara wiped her hands on a cloth, set the cloth on the counter, and opened the front door before he reached the gate. He stopped on the path. They looked at each other across the cleared yard in the gray morning light. Clara standing straight in her own doorway, one hand resting on the frame, her pregnancy visible and completely unapologetic, her silver hair neat, her deep brown eyes steady and direct. Her son standing on the path with his coat collar up against the cold, and something working beneath the composed surface of his face that she recognized as the specific discomfort of a person who has prepared for one version of a conversation and arrived to find an entirely different one waiting. "I heard you were here," he said. "I live here," Clara said. Simply. Without edge. Without the performance of strength that would have suggested she needed to perform it. Just a statement of fact delivered by a woman who had stopped requiring anyone's acknowledgement of her circumstances somewhere between the iron box and the signed papers and the chair with her initials. She stepped back from the door. He came in. She made tea the way she always had, without asking how he took it because she had made his tea for 30 years and the answer had not changed. Set 2 cups on the kitchen table. Sat down. He stood for a moment in the kitchen doorway looking at the room around him, the clean surfaces, the repaired window frame, the fire visible through the doorway to the front room, the general undeniable evidence of a woman who had not only survived but had built something in the process. Then he sat down across from her. He talked the way people talk when what they rehearsed no longer fits what they have found. Starting and stopping. Rearranging sentences mid-delivery. She let him work through it entirely without helping because she had spent enough years smoothing other people's difficult moments and she was finished with that particular habit. He said he had been wrong. She waited. He said the family had been frightened. She looked at him across the table. At this man she had given everything to. She thought about her mother, about 11 letters in an iron box, about a quilt sewn by hands she couldn't remember, about a woman who had looked forward across decades and prepared the ground for a daughter she would never see grow up. She thought about what real love actually looks like. Not the loud, convenient kind. The quiet, costly kind. The kind that does things in private that nobody will ever see and asks for nothing in return and leaves doors open in the dark for people who don't yet know they need them. She thought about the difference between that love and what her son had offered her on the night he pointed at the door. "I know you were frightened," she said finally. Her voice even. Her hands around her cup. But frightened people still choose what they do next. The kitchen was very quiet. He looked at his hands on the table. At the steam rising from his cup. At the surface of the old wood between them that had been cleaned back to something close to its original color. Then he looked up. His eyes were different now. Something had moved in them, not resolution exactly, not the clean arrival at a decision. More like the beginning of understanding what a decision would actually cost. "Can I be there?" he said quietly. "When the baby comes?" Clara looked at him for a long time. Long enough for the tea to cool slightly. Long enough for the fire in the next room to shift and settle. Long enough for her to feel, with complete clarity, what the true answer was. And then she gave it to him. The baby was born on a Tuesday morning in early March. In the upstairs room. In the house on Ellery Street. In the room her mother had prepared with a handmade quilt and a shelf of old books and a wooden chair with 2 initials carved so carefully into the back leg that you had to know to look for them. Clara held her daughter in the gray morning light and looked at her face for a long time. That new complete face. Already entirely itself. Already carrying something individual and unrepeatable in the particular set of the eyes and the specific curve of the mouth that no other face in the world would ever quite duplicate. She named her Margaret. Her own middle name. Her mother's choice, made before Clara could speak or understand or know that names carry things forward across time in ways that matter. Margaret. Passed now to a 3rd generation in a room that had been waiting for exactly this. Her son was there. He had kept his promise, had arrived the evening before and taken the wooden chair and stayed through the long hours of the night without complaint or restlessness. Just present. Quietly and completely present in the way that costs something real and that Clara recognized as the first genuinely costly thing he had offered her in a very long time. She did not make it easy for him. She also did not make it impossible. That was all she had. It was enough for now. Dot was there too. Of course she was. In the months that followed, the house on Ellery Street changed its reputation in the town quietly and without announcement. People came. Neighbors first, curious about the smoke and the cleaned windows and the woman who had moved into the town's longest-standing mystery without any visible hesitation. Then others. Then, simply as a matter of course, the way people come to a place that has decided to be warm and has the fire to prove it. Clara let them come. She thought often about her mother. About a woman who had loved her across 4 decades and an impossible distance with the specific practical foresight of someone who understood that the most important thing you can leave another person is not money or objects but evidence. Clear, lasting, undeniable evidence that you believed in their survival before they believed in it themselves. A house that already knew her name. A fire that didn't go out. A door left open in the snow. Some evenings after Margaret was asleep and the house had gone quiet, Clara sat in the wooden chair in the upstairs room with her fingers resting on the carved initials and thought about the night she had stood on a front step with 1 bag and 7 words still ringing in her chest and nowhere to go. How close she had come to turning a different way. How different everything would have been. She pressed her fingers into the carved letters. Felt her mother's hands in them across all those years. And understood, completely, finally, in the way you only understand things that have taken a lifetime to arrive, that the people who love us most sometimes do it entirely out of our sight. In quiet rooms. In careful preparations. In doors left open on snowing nights for daughters who don't yet know they are coming home. All you have to do is walk through.